99, there's something you should know. It's time that someone finally spoke the truth.
Hello, and welcome to the Libertarian Idealist podcast. My name is Antonio. I am joined by Katrina.
Hello, everyone.
Thank you for joining us today. This is our inaugural show, hopefully one of very many, where we will be talking about specifically political issues related to individual liberty, as well as various issues in philosophy, science, and how essentially they interact with culture and every one of our daily lives. I wanted to kind of talk very briefly as a somewhat of a way of introducing you to what this show will be about. Idealism is a very sometimes controversial word. Most people would say that idealism is a bad thing. Idealism negates certain real-world circumstances in the name of hard principles. It's essentially dealing in the black and white. And a lot of people say that that's a bad thing, that you should always be in the gray area, be flexible. And in the world of politics, we're always taught that compromise is king, work with people you disagree with, find an outcome that will make both sides happy. The reality is very often, and I think Ayn Rand put this best, in the compromise between good and evil, only evil prevails. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're talking about idealism, at least in the political world. That compromise is not necessarily a good thing. Idealism, perhaps in your personal life, may not get you too far, but politically, where objective standards are necessary, idealism is a very, very good thing.
Yes, and I think it's important to, it's important to compromise, but the idealism should always be there in the sense that you should always know what those ideals are, because I think the problem can be that if you get into the rhythm of always compromising, you're going to sort of forget what the ideals were to begin with. So it's always important to sort of have them there, remember what they are, and strive for them as best you can.
Yes, I always, obviously in any type of philosophy, there's a philosophical base, a guiding light, an overarching principle. And any time that you get into compromises in terms of anything that is a core value, whether it's a personal character issue in yourself, or if it's essentially the basis for political structure, as soon as you begin to compromise values like that and that individual or political level, I think that you are compromising essentially what you started in the first place. And I think that's something very important. And I think as a libertarian, I think that's extremely important, because libertarianism is a very black and white set of political values, in that the individual is king and your rights go as far as the person next to you go as well. And any time that your rights overlap, it is by mutual consent. And any time that, let's say, politically you compromise that value, you have essentially said that the individual's right is not a right at all, and it's subject to the legislative whims of a political figure or your neighbors.
Absolutely. And one thing that makes it hard not to compromise is the two-party system. As we all know, the GOP has sort of under its tent many individuals who on many issues disagree, and even strongly, and yet that's what it's come down to. And frankly, I think it's very sad. I think if we had more of a multi-party system, people could hold to their ideals with a lot more vigor. I think people could hold to their ideals and actually make important things happen.
That's a great point. And I think that will really, that conversation will have a very, that'll be very relevant for a lot of the things that we talk about on this show. Most notably, very recently, we've had an election. And Barack Obama has won, and he won basically up against what many viewed as only one challenger, and that was the Republicans' Mitt Romney. Two candidates who you would not necessarily say have hardcore philosophical principles. But then on the outside looking in, you had several third parties, and I'd say the two most notable ones would be the Green Party and the Libertarian Party.
It's interesting how all of this came about, because the candidate that the GOP ended up going with, it was, in many ways, he had this reputation of being a moderate, a compromiser, to use that word again. And that's maybe part of what was his downfall, that and the fact that, at least in my opinion, and in the opinion of many writers that I've looked to for post-election analysis, that he didn't compromise when it came to social issues. And that's one thing that I think the tide is turning in this country with regard to social issues, especially now that many of the voters are under 40. And I think next time around, it's got to be somebody who has room in his heart for gay people and for women and for Latinos and for loosening up a little bit on immigration.
I think you're 100% correct. I think inevitably it was the lack of compromise on those values specifically that I think kept a lot of voters away from Mitt Romney. And honestly, it probably kept a lot of voters away from Barack Obama. Your average person who is, let's say, maybe a little bit skeptical about voting, for the most part, their reasoning is most of these guys are liars. We don't really know what they stand for anyway. I think if you had somebody in Mitt Romney or Barack Obama who were very honest and said, you know what, I think the fight against gay marriage is just straight up bigotry, and what the hell are we doing prohibiting gays from adopting or getting married? I think for the most part you would have those sideline voters lining up and saying, finally, somebody who is saying something not just because a poll tells him to say it, but it's because it's part of his philosophical core.
Yes, and I'm finding in my own interaction with fellow libertarians, I used to have this perception of religious people that they absolutely couldn't be libertarians, that they had no room for libertarian ideas, and I'm finding that's not true. I mean, Ron Paul would be a good example of that. But I've recently learned a family member of mine who a distant family member I didn't know very well before, but who is a very religious person who in her private life believes that homosexuality is something that needs to be cured and that sort of thing. She is nonetheless a libertarian and nonetheless sticks to her ideals in the sense that she realizes that, okay, these are the beliefs that I have in my own home, for my own family. This is what I'm going to teach my children. And okay, as sad as I think that is, I do think it's commendable that at the same time she realizes these are not issues for the government to regulate. So I think that's possible. I think there are people out there who can have libertarian ideas politically and understand where the line is drawn with regard to government intervention, but at the same time have very strict values for how they lead their own lives. And I think that's a laudable position to take.
I think we are seeing a little bit of a turn for the better in terms of things like that. Even I have several family members who would identify as strongly religious, but are still able to cut through the intellectual red tape to arrive at the conclusion that legislating morality, at least in the non-political sense, is just totally crazy and totally unjustifiable. Several of my family members who have just been straight ticket Republicans their entire lives, the last two elections voted Libertarian. And that should be alarming to a Republican. For myself, I think I've done pretty good sales job on the libertarian agenda to my family, and I don't think that they would have otherwise at least been exposed to those values if it weren't for my craziness. But I think those are conclusions that a lot of people would inevitably arrive to if the option was available to them, or if just some intellectual conversations that aren't normally had in the typical media were available to them.
And that's a good point about proselytizing, and I mean that in a good way, getting the word out that, one, libertarianism exists, and two, what it is, and I guess three, who the candidates are. I have found in this past election that as soon as people found out who Gary Johnson was, what he stood for, what he was about, saw just a couple of news articles about him, were like, wow, where has this guy been all of my life? I think it's important to get the word out, largely because people just simply don't know that there are options. And as soon as they come to know that, many of them are willing to run in that direction.
Oh, without a doubt. The first libertarian candidate I ever met was Michael Badnarik, and compare that to George Bush and John Kerry, who were just such careful, calculated political figures who by name are individuals, but every time that you saw them on TV, that you were essentially seeing a collective vision of a party that's telling him, each one of them, exactly what to say, exactly how to say it, exactly how folksy to be as you're saying it. It was just so gross. And then you meet a political candidate that actually has some core values, who does not actually feel the pressure of being swayed from one side to another in the name of winning or some sort of political utility. That is incredibly refreshing. And the second that you see something like that, you are automatically inspired.
Absolutely. And that's another point, is just how do these candidates sell themselves? And I think they're not doing a great job of it, at least the main party candidates. And it may very well be because of what you say, that they have to sort of appeal to everybody in a sense. And I think there's a saying about, if you stand for everything, you stand for nothing. And people are, by and large, many people are kind of stupid. Let's just put that out there. But people aren't that stupid, and people have a sense when they're being shafted. People feel it when somebody is pulling the wool over their eyes. And I think people felt it in this election, and I think they felt it with regard to both the GOP and the Democratic candidates.
Without a doubt. I mean, there's no question that, yes, for lack of a better word, there are a lot of stupid people out there. There's a lot of somebody's watching these Honey Boo Boo shows on TV, and whoever they are, they also vote. And I think those people are accessible intellectually, but I think it has to be dumbed down, or at least, for lack of a better way of putting it, it just needs to be a little bit easier to digest. And I think that libertarianism has become a little bit easier to digest, mostly because the messengers are getting better. Gary Johnson was a great messenger. Ron Paul was a great messenger. And even though I would never consider him to be a libertarian, in rhetoric, Ronald Reagan was an excellent advocate for individual liberty. Yeah, he obviously had a lot of religious baggage and a lot of social conservatism, but in rhetoric, nobody really, except for Barry Goldwater and Ayn Rand, really made that philosophical case for individual liberty, the importance of being a free person. And I remember Ronald Reagan. I'm old enough to remember him. I wasn't old enough to vote for him, but there was, for lack of a better word, there was a warmth about him that you just don't see with Mitt Romney. In fact, with Mitt Romney, there's something kind of chilling and off-putting about him. Yes.
You don't see it with Paul Ryan, but you did see it with Reagan. You get that warmth with Ron Paul. You definitely get that warmth with Gary Johnson. And I think that's important. You've got to have that sort of personal connection, and maybe it's the way that they communicate. Maybe it has something to do with who their advisors are, or just simply their personalities. But that's not something that you can just say, well, I'm going to look past that. Those, like you said before, the honey boo boo people. That's how you're going to communicate with those people, with those independent voters, as they're called.
So my question to you, Katrina, is with this election in the books, I think there's a lot of negativity to be had. I ate a full plate of negativity the day of the election, and then the day after, I was ready for some helpings of positivity. And since then, I've pretty much came to the conclusion that for the most part, the election was a positive one. Most people would look to essentially the presidential outcome solely as that gauge for how the election went. But if you look into the nitty-gritty details of the various outcomes, including the presidential election, popular vote totals, a few ballot initiatives, and a few Senate level and Congress level races, there is perhaps a little bit to be encouraged about.
I agree. And I think one of the most encouraging things is that people maybe learned a lesson. And I, of course, mean especially people on the GOP side. Since this election, I've seen some excellent articles. Of course, it's largely what is that sports expression? I don't know much about sports. Monday
morning
night.
Quarterbacking.
Yeah. And but I think people were starting to get it even before then. And one in particular, one article I wanted to mention by Nick Gillespie on the Reason.com website. And I just pulled this one sentence that I think kind of sums it up. If Republicans failed to engage the libertarian sentiments of voters when it comes to social issues, it also failed to put forth a serious alternative to Obama's dismal record of increasing government spending with promises of yet more to come. And I think that just about says it all. On the one hand, the Republicans put forth a candidate who was basically fairly backwards on social issues, and certainly his VP was perhaps even more so. And that didn't resonate with people. But on the other hand, he wasn't even a fiscal conservative. So it's like, well, what do we have here? What is the alternative to all of the things that we don't like about Obama? You know, all of those people out there who are on the GOP side who don't like Obama aren't even getting what they might want in their other candidate, at least if they were paying attention. And then there was a David Bose article, and he made a point that summed up in the first sentence. The first thing Republicans should do is stop reading only the conservative media. And I think that's an excellent piece of advice. If all you do is watch Fox News, if the only person you listen to is Rush Limbaugh, you're not going to get the whole story. You're not doing yourself any favors. And while there's something fun and exciting about hearing somebody tell you what you want to hear, you're not going to make any progress either. So it's important to read the Huffington Post, to watch CNN, to read other commentators, if for no other reason than because it helps you firm up your own position. It helps you understand what other people are saying.
Yeah, I think we fall too easily into the trap of filtering things that we only want to hear. I know that I'm guilty of that as well. I mean, should I be spending all day on Reason.com? I should probably be looking at a few other things as well. Not that Reason isn't an objective source of news, but I think it's always good policy to diversify your news sources.
Well, I think we're all guilty of that to some extent, so I'm certainly not going to be casting stones in that sense. I mean, I do this myself, but every once in a while I sort of force myself to listen to Rush Limbaugh. It's painful,
oh, yeah.
but I do it, and I try at least to hear what other people are saying, and it's usually quite informative. And again, if for no other reason, you do it as a learning experience and so that you're more prepared to make good arguments.
I find it an excellent practice to put on Sean Hannity every now and then, just to anything that's pissing me off that particular day. is totally erased if I listen to just 2 or 3 minutes of Sean Hannity.
Absolutely.
It is. It's just one of those like fingernails on chalkboard moments for me. But I think that I think that there are some valuable lessons to be learned here, especially for Republicans. Yes, you're exactly right. The Fox News bubble is a large bubble, but it's one that you have to get out of. For the most part, you will just not get a good sense of what's going on, and the same thing goes for your Daily Show crowd or your Bill Maher crowd. I can't stand watching Bill Maher's show, and really I should. He's a guy that self-identifies as a libertarian, but if you just take a listen to the audience on any one of the Daily Show or I can't think of what's the name of Bill Maher's show now? Politically Incorrect. Real time. That's right.
And I have no idea how he can get away with calling himself a libertarian. Let me just
I
put
know.
that out there.
But the lesson to be learned here is that things aren't always as they seem. For the most part, in most of the post-election analysis, you'll see from Fox News and from the liberal news outlets or MSNBC, their spin on the outcomes are very interesting, to say the least. Fox News crowd, for the most part, has essentially come to the conclusion that the Republican Party had abandoned its principles and they needed a more strong conservative, even though Mitt Romney called himself a severe conservative, which is laughable all by itself. And the left, of course, has had validation that a candidate like Barack Obama is exactly what they need. Somebody who has essentially compromised on every major issue he originally campaigned for last time around. They have been taught nothing. And I think that's going to be bad for them in the long run. But I think that some of the Monday morning quarterbacking going on within the GOP can be beneficial because there is a crowd out there that is starting to have that real honest conversation with themselves. And I look most notably to Bill Kristol, who I find to be one of the most nauseating Republicans ever. I met him along with Fred Barnes once at an old college event. And he was just one of the most pompous assholes you will ever come across. And he was one of the worst ones during the GOP primaries, totally discounting and poo-pooing the Ron Paul candidacy, much to his inevitable dismay, because the Ron Paul candidacy became very legitimate. And even he, just a week ago, had a very honest conversation on Fox saying that the Ron Paul movement is here to stay, and he would not be surprised whatsoever if Rand Paul was a serious contender for the 2016 GOP presidential primary. So I think that we're coming upon a time where I think the cream is starting to rise to the top in terms of what really happened in the 2012 election.
Right, and people are starting to get it. At least people are starting to get libertarian principles. At least that's what I've been seeing among many voters. But one of the problems, I think, is language. And you mentioned before someone saying that the GOP isn't, quote, conservative enough. And what I mean about language is the word conservative, the word liberal, what do those words even mean anymore?
Correct.
They've taken on so many different personalities throughout the years, and at some point maybe you say socially conservative or socially liberal. You have to qualify it with that word, but I like the idea of abandoning those words altogether. If words start to become so ambiguous that nobody really agrees on what they mean, just get rid of them. And that's one thing I noticed Gary Johnson doing during this election is he didn't use those two words. And I think that was really very clever, because if you happen to be somebody who identifies as a conservative, the word liberal is going to be off-putting. If you're an self-identified liberal, the word conservative is off-putting. So just get rid of those words. And what he did is he called himself socially tolerant and fiscally responsible. And so I think that's another direction we need to head in, is using our words a little bit more carefully, because words do have emotional baggage, and words like conservative and liberal especially have emotional baggage. And in fact, to the point that the emotional baggage has essentially obliterated the meaning, the actual denotation. The connotation is much stronger than the denotation.
Yeah, how could you say that about the red team? I'm on the red team. How could you say that about the blue team? I'm on the blue team. And you just don't like me because I'm on the blue team. It's exactly the trap that people fall into. And I do think Gary Johnson did a phenomenal job of essentially starting to break down those walls. And I think that as Ron Paul fades into the sunset, you'll actually see a little bit more of that as well. The political realities of being a member of the red team, I think, got in the way of him being totally honest all the time. I think he was always honest, but I think there was always some issues that he would at least tread a little bit more lightly on if they were something that would affect, in this case, the red team. But my question to you is, we are coming off essentially what is the most successful libertarian candidacy, at least for the Libertarian Party, in history. We came across some huge victories for the gay marriage movement and in repealing the drug war. What do you have to say about these results? Is it the start of something new, or has the libertarian movement, at least in terms of the Libertarian Party or the gay? Obviously, I don't think the gay marriage or drug war has peaked, but do you think the Libertarian Party may have peaked?
I think so, and I think the numbers are telling us something. I know that Gary Johnson broke Ed Clark's 1980 vote record this election. So this has been the most successful libertarian candidacy in a very long time. In fact, one point that I think is interesting is that the state in which Gary Johnson received the most votes was his home state of New Mexico, or the state in which he served as governor for 2 terms. 3.5% of the vote in that state, a state that's largely Democratic and a state that voted in a Republican. At the time, Gary Johnson was a Republican 2 times around. That tells you something about how well he's communicating the message. And I sincerely hope that he continues to get out there and communicate the message, or at the very least that he passes the torch to somebody who can communicate it as well as he can. And I'll reiterate again that I think it's a matter of using the right language to get people on your side, or at least to allow people to be on your side who are there already. If you use terms that alienate people, you're not going to get very far. But regarding the gay marriage and the drug legalization, I think absolutely. I think the time has come. Even Pat Robertson, didn't he come out as saying he thinks cannabis should be legal? Mm-hmm. That tells you something. And I think the religious people are starting to kind of get it, that you simply can't legislate this part of people's lives.
Yeah, I have some optimism in terms of the drug legalization movement, but I also have some pessimism as well. I think that the people that are pushing drug legalization are breaking a cardinal rule in terms of changing political philosophy. And this kind of gets back to the concept of idealism. And I think this kind of gets back to why I think Mitt Romney ultimately failed to win, is because there was no hard philosophical case. A lot of times, and at least at least as far as these drug legalization movements, specifically in Washington and Colorado, came about, it was less about individual freedom in terms of how they were selling it to the public. And it was more about saying, well, you know what, we're losing this drug war anyway. And I still think that is a good pragmatic case for drug legalization. I don't want to discount that by any means. But unless we're selling people on the concept that it's my body and I can do what I want with it, no matter how stupid it is, if I want to drink bleach, if I want to eat 10 double cheeseburgers, I should be able to do that. And
absolutely. And that goes to another point that I think was a little bit of a misstep with regard to drug legalization. I say a misstep, and I mean that in a philosophical sense. Perhaps in a practical sense it wasn't, but selling cannabis legalization on the idea that, well, in some cases it can be good for you. In other words, the medical aspect. That's great, and I think it's scientifically interesting, and I think it's important to get that information out there that it can be effective against glaucoma or reducing inflammation in the brain in Alzheimer's patients. All of that is great, but that's not the point, and I'll get back to that word that you used at the very beginning of this podcast. That's not the ideal. That's not where the idealism comes from. The point is, like you said, my body, my choice. And whether or not it can be good for people in some instances is a little bit beside the point, at least from the point of view of the libertarian philosophical standpoint.
I had the fortunate opportunity to speak with Gary Johnson's vice presidential candidate, Judge Jim Gray, on a special interview for a website called the TeaPartyIsDead.com. And Judge Gray, when he was talking about the drug war, he was talking about it in a much more pragmatic sense, which is fine. Again, he still gets the concept of freedom. But as he was talking about it, he was saying, we lock up so many innocent people, which is true. But he essentially was talking about, the drugs are there. Everybody, or a lot of youths are using them, and thus are getting thrown in jail and thus are having their lives ruined. More importantly, and I think Gary Johnson does this a little bit better, and definitely I know Ron Paul was really good at this, is just saying you're free to do with your body what you want. And exactly. It's not a question of how prevalent drug usage is. It's really a totally irrelevant argument.
And I think there's a parallel to that with regard to gay marriage. And in fact, it reminds me of a Daniel Dennett quote that I really love. It's something like, there's nothing I dislike more than bad arguments for a view I hold dear. And the idea is
Great
that
line.
Somebody can agree with you, but if they're agreeing with you for the wrong reasons, then there's some point being missed. And I think the parallel with marriage equality and equal marriage rights is that the gay community is out there making the point that being gay is something entirely biological, that you're born that way. And I absolutely agree. As a person with a science background, I've read the literature. There's absolutely no question that people do not choose their sexual orientation. That said, that is not the reason that there should never be any sodomy laws. That's not the reason that people should have equal marriage rights. People should have equal marriage rights because consenting adults can do whatever the hell they want to do and can make contracts with other consenting adults for whatever reason. So whether your biology is guiding you to have sex with and want to marry someone, or whether you want to marry someone because you like the same wallpaper patterns, it doesn't matter. The point is, you're free to make contracts with other adults, and it's nobody else's business.
It's funny. I actually heard a pragmatic argument by a religious group in favor of gay marriage, and the argument, and this made me want to just explode. The idea behind legalizing gay marriage was, and I wish I could remember who wrote this because it's so crazy. I would love for people to go look at it, but it was a traditional argument for gay marriage. And the argument is that if gays aren't allowed to get married, they will continue their promiscuous ways.
I heard a similar argument, and I think or not similar, I think it's a little bit better than that one, but that heterosexual people tend to sort of, to some extent, imitate homosexual people. In other words, homosexual people are out there on the front lines with regard to what's cool, what's fashionable, that sort of thing. And so if homosexual people can't get married, then what are they going to do? They're going to cohabitate. And so heterosexual people are going to follow suit, and they're going to cohabitate as well. And cohabitation is going to become the cool, hip thing to do. Whereas if gay people can get married, and if they're having parties and marriage ceremonies and making commitments to one another, then the heterosexual people are going to follow suit and do that. And I think there might be something to that. But again, that's not the reason. The reason, when it comes right down to it, is one word, and that's freedom.
Along the lines of freedom, what do you think the future, essentially, for freedom is, especially in regards to elections? Obviously, as we just said, gay marriage had huge support at the polls, and then legalization. I mean, I always told myself that marijuana legalization would happen in my lifetime, but never did I expect it to happen at this point. I thought that was something that was going to be just way farther down the road, just because I just don't have that much confidence in people being able to shake old, bad intellectual baggage. Is this the beginning of toppling statism?
I think it might not be the beginning of toppling statism per se, and I'm only saying that because I'm being a little bit cynical here. But I think it is the start, at least, of toppling prohibition. I think we are moving in that direction, and I don't know to what extent maybe Barack Obama's failed promises with regard to suspending the drug war have perhaps in some ways helped. And what I mean is that people are starting to see that, oh, wait a minute, this is what it was supposed to be about in 2008. And not only did it not happen, it got a little bit worse. So maybe that sort of was a wake-up call for people.
Yeah, I mean, on one side, I say to myself, great, we're getting gay marriage. Gay marriage will be done. I mean, we will. That one will be done, and it'll be done soon. Gay marriage will be legal. Maybe not in all places in the South, but I think even that'll eventually come around. On drug legalization, I have this inner battle about how optimistic or pessimistic I should be about it. Because on one hand, people are getting it that, yes, this war on, at least in this case, marijuana, is A, not working, or B, morally unacceptable at a political level to prohibit. And then at the same time, at least in my state of Ohio, we just got done passing a shitload of smoking bans. So is it just that there's enough people that want to smoke weed that are getting politically active? Or what is this contradiction of, oh, people should be able to smoke weed, but hey, cigarettes are totally bad for you and we should start banning them?
Or I think it's a terrible contradiction, or trans fat is terrible for you and you shouldn't be allowed to have it, or whatever the
large sodas
prohibition du jour is. I think, unfortunately, it's that the younger generation is growing up. They themselves didn't see anything really horrible happening when their friend smoked some weed and went out and drove. They're realizing that it isn't a big deal. I wish it were because there was this sense of individual freedom, but the cynical side of me says, no, I think it's something else.
Yeah, I think that a lot of libertarians are very think that this election is a positive sign for the liberty movement, and I do think there are some reasons to share that optimism, but I can't get past points like that where the same society that is pushing for legalizing gay marriage is also the one pushing for the bans on unhealthy foods and large soda pops and smoking in a bar. And those just don't match up. And obviously the philosophical concept of liberty is being lost somewhere along the way. But I also add to that, Gary Johnson had the most successful Libertarian Party candidacy of all time. And on top of that, the Ron Paul revolution within the Republican Party is finally real and legitimate. A lot of the candidates that Ron Paul was promoting in this election cycle won big. And obviously in the presidential primary season, Ron Paul's support went from essentially being a spectator to being, one of the main event players. So what do you think about that? Are we getting somewhere on that level? Is there is there a libertarian coalition building, and that's essentially going to have to grow by itself, or are people essentially on the outside of that movement starting to respect liberty a little bit more and essentially start moving into that bubble?
Yes, I think there is some hope, and something you mentioned earlier about communicating the message. I think we're starting to do that a little bit better. And one thing that I always say to people when I'm trying to explain to them what libertarianism is, because a lot of people see it as dog eat dog. Everybody does whatever they want. And the one point I always try to make is that not everything good should be mandated. Not everything bad should be prohibited. And the point being that we can maybe agree or disagree about what things are good for you and what things are bad for you, what you should do and what you shouldn't do. It's good to give to charity. That's a good thing. It's probably bad to eat a lot of trans fat. But to move in to the next step and say, well, I'm going to put a gun to your head and force you to give to charity, or I'm going to put a gun to your head and prevent you from eating trans fat, that's the line that has to be drawn. So it isn't a matter of what's good and what's bad. It's a matter of respecting individual liberty.
So what do you think? I think as far as the Libertarian Party goes, I'm afraid that at this point, unless Gary Johnson runs again, because I think Gary Johnson has a lot of built-in support that will not go away. I think if they go in another direction, and if Gary decides not to run, they would really need an all-star in order to pull off a similar performance.
Which is why I really hope he sticks around.
Yeah, I think that'll be a very good thing. Conversely, though, I also think that 2016 provides a much better opportunity for a liberty candidate like a Rand Paul to make it through a primary. At least the chances are better than I think they were this year. Now, that could all go away. The media is really good at framing this as the most important election in our lifetimes. You only have two choices. But let's say Rand Paul were to get through, then I think obviously a libertarian candidacy would be a little bit detrimental, at least in terms of the outcome. Not that the outcome of a presidential election is all that significant by itself, but I think that, because I think underneath that there will be a big wave of liberty support.
And it depends on who Rand Paul is in 2016.
Yes.
I mean, he's maybe a little better than Mitt Romney, okay, absolutely, and has a better voting record. But we do have to remember he backed Mitt Romney, and he certainly is far from perfect. He's far from perfectly libertarian, and he's no Gary Johnson. But if he were to really get his shit together, then something interesting might happen.
Yeah, I think Rand Paul is one of the more fascinating political creatures. I think we're in a sea of a very, I'll say not a sea, an ocean of just terrible, terrible political figures and leaders who essentially are operating under one premise and one premise alone, and that is, how do I get elected? How do I get to my next step and become more powerful? I think that's the driving force between most people that are in office. Rand Paul does act with some philosophical principles, and his voting record is extremely sound, very liberty focused. But then at the same time, he is somebody. His father could not work well with anybody. His nickname, Dr. No, was a good thing and a bad thing. It was a good thing in that it inspired a huge movement of people who respected him basically on whether it's liberty or integrity. The integrity was a huge drawing point for Ron Paul. And then you have Rand Paul, who has very similar philosophical principles, but plays much nicer with the enemies, we'll say. I have a little bit of a struggle with that because I think that compromise is always a bad thing. Anytime I hear the word compromise, I want to throw up everywhere. And so when I saw Rand Paul endorse Mitt Romney on the Sean Hannity show, it was watching Arnold Schwarzenegger in a pink tutu for me. It was just absolutely terrible moment for me.
But it was like et tu, Brute.
Yes, exactly. It was just a really gross moment. And when you are, let's say, an idealist, as I would say I am, when you see a compromise like that, when you see somebody who's supposed to be this epitome of the libertarian ideal, not that I'm saying Rand is, but I think he would say that he's a staunch defender of liberty. When you see him kissing ass on the Sean Hannity show, for one thing, but then to go to somebody who's a statist like Mitt Romney, who has no track record of liberty support, and then say, I support his candidacy for president. How can I, rectify that inside of my mind?
Well, it's almost like learning there's no Santa Claus. I mean, it's painful to see someone who, by all accounts, has been pretty good with regard to liberty, stand up for someone who is anything but. And so it does make me wonder, well, what is going to happen in 4 years with this person?
Yeah, there's another candidate. His name's Justin Amash. He's a congressman in Michigan, and he is very much the Ron Paul successor in Congress. Reason did a big write-up about him a couple years ago, and he has since kind of taken off. He has a much higher profile now. And even he, in this election, he was an interesting character to watch as well. He did not make a formal endorsement in the presidential race, but he did at one point. This is not a very significant thing. I'm sure it didn't really, mean anything. But on his Facebook page during the campaign season, he talked about a specific issue. It had to do with arts funding, and he posted something and said, arts funding of the arts is a bad thing, and I think it had to do with maybe movies being filmed within like a certain city. They have like a lot of tax breaks or things like that, or subsidies for movie companies to come in and film things in their district or their area. And he said, this is a really bad thing that congressmen do or legislative representatives do, which is why I was really opposed to it when Gary Johnson did it when he was governor of New Mexico.
Ooh.
And it was just like, really? Are you gonna attack the most liberty candidate out there? It was just there's a million other fish to fry. And I thought it was very odd that he had done that. So what I wonder is, how can, if a libertarian coalition is necessary, which I think it is, then how does the Libertarian Party and the GOP play nice? It was very obvious that the Ron Paul campaign and the Gary Johnson campaign never really played nicely together. Not until the end, where Ron Paul made it very obvious, that Gary Johnson was probably who he was going to support. At least he did in code. That's how I read it.
That's how I read it too. Code is exactly what I would have said.
Yeah. So how does that happen when the political strategists come in, because they are inevitably who controls how the parties interact with one another, if at all. It was very obvious Jesse Benton, who was running Ron Paul's campaign, was totally against the Gary Johnson campaign. How do you see that playing out? Can the Libertarian Party and the Liberty Movement within the Republican Party end up playing nice together?
I think really one of two things has to happen. Either the GOP has to learn its lesson and, lick its wounds a little bit, but get up and learn the lesson that it can't be so backwards with regard to social issues. And as an aside, that it has to actually be fiscally responsible, because I've decided not to use the word conservative anymore. But either that has to happen, or the Libertarian Party has to simply take over. But I don't think there's any meeting halfway. I certainly don't think there's any compromise to be had. And I don't know if the Libertarian Party could take over, at least in practical terms. I think I read once, and unfortunately I don't have a source for this, but that it takes about 50 years for a party to become to overtake one of the main parties and become the other main party. But it's a question that maybe we'll start to see the answer to in 2016.
And I think that's why my gut is to give Rand Paul the benefit of the doubt, because the way I see it, the only way that this liberty movement can succeed, at least in the two-prong approach that we're seeing now, within the Republican Party and within the Libertarian Party, the only way that they can really end up succeeding is if each one just sticks to the principles. They stick to the good voting record, the good sound philosophy, and nothing else. If they want to go ahead and suck the toes of bad candidates, they can go ahead and do that. As distasteful as it is for me, by all means, go ahead and play that game. I mean, hey, the Libertarian Party had some baggage of its own in the last election in 2008, where they said that Bob Barr was an adequate candidate. He was not a true libertarian by any means. So I think that inevitably you will always come across, at least in the political game, a few nightmarish occurrences. But no matter what, as long as your voting record is pristine and you're always standing up for a sound philosophy, I need to train myself to get over those crappy moments like a Mitt Romney endorsement that in the grand scheme of things don't really matter all that much.
And I think that's a good point that you mentioned voting records. I think most people don't really even look at that. And in fact, what they're looking at is the charisma. They're listening to the sound bites. And unfortunately, that's just the way of the world, where it's a soundbite world. They're looking at social media and the little posters that people make and put on Facebook with quotes. And really, if you want to be an intelligent voter, you got to just look at the guy's voting record, because that tells you a whole lot more than the sort of fuzzy feeling you're getting from the guy.
So that's the Republican Party, and that's the Libertarian Party. My question about the Democratic Party is a very complicated one for me, because I've always thought that there are so many Democrats out there who are huge supporters of liberty and huge supporters of the anti-war movement. And I've never understood how a libertarian candidate has not risen to the surface and even poked his head out of the ground within the Democratic Party. I tend to know a little bit more about the Republican Party because I originally was a Republican, at least when I was a child and didn't really know anything. But I've always known a little bit more about the Republican Party just because I have that old baggage that I haven't totally shaken yet, even though I hate both parties equally. Have you even ever heard of a libertarian Democrat?
I mean, the only time I ever voted for a Democrat was when I voted for Obama, and that was largely because I wasn't thrilled with Bob Barr, and I was absolutely fed up with Bush. But I think maybe that's starting to happen. I think Gary Johnson was sort of an interesting candidate because he did appeal to many Democrats. Now, largely he appealed to them because they were fed up with Obama. But I happen to know, because I know this in my own experience, people that I've spoken to, there are a lot of previous Obama supporters who voted for Gary Johnson. And maybe that's unusual in this election. Maybe that's the first time that that's happened. But I think that says a lot about what a good communicator Gary Johnson is. I mean, he was always out there with his peace T-shirt on. He knew how to draw people from the Democratic side, and you got to hand it to him. The Democrats have, by and large, been great supporters of the anti-war movement. They've been great supporters of marriage equality, and those who were paying attention have realized in the past 4 years that their guy hasn't stood up for those values. And I think that's why it was a prime situation for Gary Johnson to sort of swoop in and woo those voters.
As the dust has settled on this election, I want to kind of go back to that Monday morning quarterbacking concept. I've read a couple articles that have said, the GOP didn't really, come out swinging. And really, I don't think Obama really came out swinging, at least on a philosophical level. I thought it was a very neutered campaign as far as the two big parties are concerned. But I think that, and this is one of the reasons I have some optimism, if there were to be a libertarian Democrat, or if Rand Paul were to run in 2016, or even Justin Amash if he was to run for a larger position. or any liberty-minded candidate. I know people are making a big deal out of Thomas Massey and a couple other ones that have just entered in. I don't know very much about them, so don't consider that a rubber stamp on whether or not I think they're sweet or not. But I think that a lot of people have kind of gotten it wrong about why Mitt Romney lost this election and why Barack Obama's numbers were so low compared to the last time around. Voter enthusiasm, even though this was a hotly contested presidential election, voter enthusiasm was very, very low on both sides of the aisle. I think that what has been missed, and I think this is why Ron Paul became so successful, especially in the recent years, is it kind of goes back to that Coke and Pepsi comparison of Republicans and Democrats, at least at the presidential election level. The difference between Romney and Barack Obama, and I think Gary Johnson said this a lot, is that it's Coke and Pepsi. And Gary Johnson called himself the Perrier. Perrier is drastically different from Coke and Pepsi. And for so long now, we have not had, at a major level, somebody who has been that Perrier, somebody who has made that ideological case for liberty. And Ron Paul has done that, and it has worked. He has inspired a movement that will not die anytime soon. And he has inspired people to learn more about free market economics, the gold standard, learn about the Federal Reserve, the banking system, why it's important that individuals are free. That's something that was totally foreign to most people just 10 years ago. So as we're looking at what happened, what went wrong for Mitt Romney, why didn't so many people come out for Barack Obama, I think it's a very easy answer that neither candidate really distinguished themselves as being anything. They were just there. I smile nicer than this guy. I went to this swing state more than this guy. It was nothing like what Ronald Reagan did. It was nothing like what Barry Goldwater did in that they inspired a philosophical movement. Whether or not they were, great political animals in the end is totally irrelevant. What they started was something very different. It was a moral case for freedom, a moral case for capitalism. And I think that the reason Mitt Romney inevitably lost is that he never really distinguished himself. So instead of saying, oh, Mitt Romney needed to be a little bit nicer on capitalism and closing down auto industry or auto plants in Ohio or Michigan, what he really should have done is totally owned all of that and said, no, these businesses definitely should have closed, and here's why it would have been good for every single one of us. And he never really did that. He just ended up apologizing for all that.
Yes, he should have taken some stances and he should have had better advisors. I mean, again, just looking at it cynically, but yes, he was the guy who didn't seem to stand for anything. And it was just so painfully obvious that he was parroting whatever his bad advisors told him he needed to say. And anybody with any sense knows that that's exactly what was going on.
Barack Obama was a candidate who should have been very easy. The economy was terrible. And even better, everything that he campaigned on, he didn't deliver on. I mean, most everything. And all this election needed was some sort of intellectual giant to come in with a big whooping stick. And Mitt Romney did not. He brought a slingshot, for lack of a better term. I think that what this election needed, what the American people need more than anything, is somebody to really offer a clear choice. Someone to make a philosophical case against big government, statism, the police state, however you want to phrase it. Nobody at a high level is advocating for freedom. And right now, the highest office where we have a liberty candidate is Rand Paul. And if that's the best we got, I mean, I think it's a little unfortunate because I think, as we said, Rand has some a little bit of baggage that we'd like to see fixed. But I mean, all we needed was somebody to essentially come up and lay it out on the line.
Exactly. And somebody to send the message, it's your life, your choices, and it's none of my business. That's the message that a good candidate needs to send. That, okay, I'm gonna work for you in the sense that I'm going to do what I can to keep us safe, but beyond that, none of my business. None of my business who you have sex with, none of my business what you put in your body, none of my business where you put your money, whether or not you give to charity, how you save for your retirement. None of my business. That needs to be the message.
I'm convinced that if Mitt Romney I think that the real Mitt Romney is pro-choice. I think the real Mitt Romney, it would be pro-gay marriage, just like the real Barack Obama is for the drug war, or is against the drug war. Sorry, I think a lot of these guys make huge compromises at an intellectual level in order to win elections and to appease demographics.
I think you're probably right. I mean, it's hard. We can never really know who is the real Mitt Romney and how would the real Mitt Romney behave if he were invited to a gay wedding.
Sure.
But I think you're onto something. I think he probably just plain old doesn't give a shit.
Yeah, that's what I would think. Most adults.
And it's too bad, because I think if he had come out a little bit more liberty-minded with regard to social issues, I think he really could have made some headway. Despite the problems with his economic record, I think he could have made some headway. And I often wonder if he had chosen a different VP, if maybe simply that would have been enough. I was thinking Condoleezza Rice. Now, of course, she's got the baggage from the Bush years, so maybe that wouldn't have been the right choice. But somebody like Condoleezza Rice, who's got a pretty good record, at least rhetorically, of fiscal responsibility. And again, there I am using that word, responsibility, not conservatism, but who is pro-choice, who's at least doesn't hate the gays. That might have been the better move.
I think courage is infectious, and I think if Mitt Romney would have, if he really does feel this way, I don't want to put philosophy in his mouth, but my guess, if I had to pick either way, my guess is he's still pro-choice. He didn't have an evolution on the issue, and I don't think he's against gay marriage. I still don't understand how any adult who has an ounce of sense in them is against gay marriage, but whatever, it is what it is. But my gut on him is that he's exactly what he was. He was a Massachusetts moderate, and a Massachusetts moderate doesn't have those kind of hangups. And I think if he were to just have the courage to have come out and said, you know what, even though that a lot of my party disagrees with me on this, I am in total support of gay marriage. And I think that trying to restrict marriage based on your sexual orientation is bigotry at its very core.
Absolutely.
If he made that case, sure, I guarantee there'd be a lot of bitching from social conservatives, and a lot of them would stay home. But I'd say you'd make that up in dividends.
Absolutely. And, you're never going to know until you try. And I think that's precisely what would have happened. I think he would have won had it not been for those social positions. And I think we can just look to Gary Johnson and see what happened there. Here was a Republican, now ex-Republican, who, while he was still a Republican, came out and said, hey, I get it. This is bigotry, pure and simple. Why can't gay people get married? And what happened? He got kicked out of the GOP. There's that. But he got a big following. And I think you're right. If a GOP candidate were to just open up a little bit, it would be astounding what would happen. I'd love to see what would happen. I think it would be huge. I mean, and I think it would really start bridging the gap in the big cities. My district, I'd say it's middle class to affluent, a lot of white, well-off voters in my area, and most of them, I would say, are very fiscally conservative, very big supporters of capitalism. They respect hard work because they work hard themselves. Those people should be voting Republican. And just a very simple, non-scientific straw poll of my neighbors tells me that, yes,
They're totally against a lot of what Obama's pushing at an economic level, but they cannot get over the social conservative baggage of the Republican Party. So many people my age, which I'm now 30 years old, I know so many people who should be essentially, and I say should because, based on economic issues, but should be voting for the, Republican or the pro capitalism party. But instead, they see people like Rick Santorum, they see people like Todd Akin, and they say, I don't want my fingerprints on this party at all.
Exactly. I think there's an emotional component to the social side of things that maybe isn't quite there for the economic side of things. And I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong or which issues are ultimately more important, but it's something that we do have to at least acknowledge. And I'm like this myself. I have a way of sort of forgiving people for having non-libertarian or I guess I should say liberal economic positions. And yet when people have non-libertarian social positions, when they're against gay marriage, I just simply can't get over it. It just rubs me the wrong way.
Sure.
And I can't get over it. I can't vote for a Rick Santorum, no matter how good he is with regard to economic positions. And again, you can say that's silly or that's right or wrong, but we all need to simply acknowledge that those social things push buttons that the economic issues simply don't push.
Well, we're not too far removed from the civil rights movement. And we've read about it in our textbooks growing up about just how crazy this country was just 50 years ago. And we remember that. And this sounds eerily similar to that. So we don't want to be part of, we know it's coming. All right. Gay marriage is going to be legal. All right. We know that this is bigotry going on. This is discrimination going on, and it's allowed. And we will look back on this in 10, 15 years, 20 years, whenever this is totally over, and say, wow, we were a bunch of assholes back then. We were a bunch of crazy assholes back then. And people that are 20, 30, 40 years old don't want to have to look back in history and say, I was one of those assholes.
Exactly. And I think it may, hopefully it's going to happen a lot faster. And maybe one of the reasons is TV, and we've got gay characters on TV who are lovable, and people are realizing it's not so strange. Maybe back in the civil rights time, people were philosophically against any kind of racism, but when it comes right down to it, they probably didn't have black friends, or they didn't see black characters on TV shows. But now you've got Modern Family, and you've got Mitch and Cameron, and they're just such a cute couple, and you love them, and they've got a little girl, and you're in their homes every day, and it's a totally different social milieu.
And I think that's why there is some optimism to be had. I do think that this election, by and large, is a positive one, even though Liberty did not win in the end. I think that compared to 2008 or 2004 or 2000, we are making tremendous strides, whether it's the Libertarian Party or the Ron Paul movement, or just on individual issues like gay marriage and drug legalization. I think we're starting to. I think Seinfeld said it in an episode of Seinfeld. He said, ending a relationship, you don't just push over the vending machine. You got to rock it back and forth a couple times, and then you push it over. And I think that's a little bit of what's going on right now. But I do think that if it doesn't work, and if the Liberty movement fizzles out, let's say, I don't think it'll do it by the next election, but let's say it fizzles out after that, I do think that we are coming close to that revolutionary point where eventually the citizenry will not vote back their rights, and it's going to have to be essentially taken. Either this place is going to burn, either this country is going to burn to the ground, or people are just going to leave en masse. You say your citizens will shrug in a sense.
It's time to knock over the vending machine.
I'm with you. And I think that's all I had for today. Katrina, I want to thank you very much for joining me today. I hope our listeners agree that the Libertarian Idealist is something worth passing on to a friend, maybe.
Absolutely. Yes. Spread the word.
So thank you for joining us. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's at the Liberty Idealist. On Facebook, just look up the Libertarian Idealist. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
It's time that someone finally spoke the truth. You might say I've lost my mind, and you might say I'm low. Why, you might even say